I really believe in giving your kids increasing amounts of freedom to make their choices, and they're going to sometimes pick things that you're not crazy about. And I think there's a time to say, you know what, I really feel like that's out of bounds and we're not going to go there. But I think by the time your kids are 16, 17, 18, you've got to be giving them the freedom to make some of those choices. And then you talk about it.
Welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. This is the show where I interview major thought leaders from many fields of influence to show how our worldview changes everything. You can find the show everywhere podcasts are found. And if you like it, would you please consider leaving a review on your favorite platform? That helps more people find the show. One of the big questions we try to deal with on the show is, how can we be in culture but not of culture? What about pop culture? TV, movies, social media. We're being bombarded with information all of the time and influences that we need to know how to discipline in our lives. So how do we do it? Well, my guest today is Adam Holz. Adam is the managing copy editor for Plugged In, focused on the family's media review and discernment website. Adam has worked at Plugged In for 14 years, and in that time, he's reviewed, get this, over 600 movies, as well as hundreds more albums and songs as the site's primary music reviewer. Adam previously had a 7-year stint at NavPress as an associate editor for Discipleship Journal. He's the author of the NavPress Bible study, Beating Busyness, and has written for a number of other publications. He's also been interviewed by all of the bigs, MSNBC, MTV, CBN, Moody Radio, and so forth. Adam's married to Jennifer. They have 3 teenage children. We're going to have a great conversation about how to be discerning in the culture. Please welcome Adam Holz to the show. Adam Holz, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast.
Dr. Jeff, thanks for having me on today.
We don't get to do these very often where we're in person, face to face. But you're a guy here in town, working for Focus on the Family. You have reviewed hundreds of movies, hundreds of albums, all of these things from a biblical perspective, looking at things that are happening in the culture. And so we just got to clear the decks right off the bat. Why is this something Christians should be doing or even care about?
Well, the culture, obviously, it's kind of in the ether, right? We talk about culture a lot. We talk about the culture wars, but it's still kind of an abstraction. The reality is that culture is sinking in, right? And it's out there and it influences us. And I have a ridiculous example that shows my point. When my kids were little, one day they came home from school singing Jingle Bells, Batman Smells, Robin Laid an Egg, right? Okay, so you and I did that 40 or 50 years ago.
I remember that.
It's still in the ether of the culture. And I just marveled at how even in our visual screen-oriented world, that culture is always at work, and it's at work around us. And now with the advent of smartphones, even families that I think have really cultivated healthy boundaries and maybe more restrictions than some out there, your kids are interacting with other kids, and that world is out there. And one of my favorite passages of scripture is Ephesians 5:15 through 17. And the Apostle Paul says in the NIV, "Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil." Now, I'm not a Hebrew or Greek scholar, but that phrase, "be very careful," is blepo or blepo, and it means see then how you walk around. I think that King James translates it, walk circumspectly. And so Paul is communicating that as you move through the world, have your head up, be alert to what's happening, because that the cultural trajectory toward evil, that's a word that's fallen on hard times in our culture, right? We think of serial killers or bombers or, that sort of thing. But evil is the path away from God. And Paul's saying the trajectory and the bent of the world is away from God. Be alert to how that is at work. And certainly in entertainment and pop culture, those nudges are all over the place, which isn't to say it's all bad. We can find good things too, but we've got to be alert to it.
Right. You've got to be alert to it. And a lot of Summit Ministries draws back to an Old Testament passage about understanding the times.
Yes.
The tribe of Issachar understood
Yep.
the times and knew what Israel ought to do.
Yeah.
If you don't have your finger on the pulse, you can't know whether the body
right.
of culture is actually
Yeah.
alive. But even if it is alive,
Yeah.
I understand movies, and I haven't really. I went to a conference once and they said Christians should be paying attention to the movies, and they're giving me all these examples, and I just thought most of these movies just bore me to death.
Yeah.
I can't stand the thought of sitting still for 2 hours doing anything.
Right.
And so that's always been super hard for me because I'm more of I got to be moving, going,
Yeah.
all of that. But I do understand, at least intellectually, that the movies of a culture tell the stories of the people.
Yeah.
The songs of the culture tell the
Yes.
stories of the people.
Yep.
So on the positive side, if I watch a movie or listen to a song, I can think, you know what? They articulated what I understand to be true about my life in a way that I couldn't.
Yeah.
On the negative side,
Yeah.
I could say, wow, that person's really down. And I can relate to that. Maybe I should be down too.
Right.
So it isn't just that the stories of the culture tell the direction of the culture. It is that the stories of the culture can determine the direction of the culture, even in a toxic way.
No, that's exactly right. And there's a guy on the East Coast named Walt Mueller. He has an organization called the Center for Parent Youth Understanding. And I love his illustration. He says that culture is a map and a mirror. And so sometimes when somebody creates something, I'll take Eli Roth, for example. He's a horror director.
Yeah.
He did Hostel. He had a quote a number of years ago. It basically said, I love sex and violence and all of it together because it's all imaginary, right? It's fake. It's not real, and we should know that. And I think, well, that's a really self-serving argument. And there are creatives who say, well, we just want to reflect what's happening in the culture. And I think that's half of the story, but there is that map side of things too, right? And so the synonyms I would use is it reflects culture, but it also reinforces culture. That those cultural artifacts, I've tried to teach my kids who are 13, 15, and 17, every single piece of entertainment that we engage with, or not even things that we would necessarily think about as entertainment, commercials, for example, there's always a worldview there. They're always answering or addressing the question, what is normal, what is right, what is good, or sometimes what is broken,
Yes.
but there's a question being answered, and we can appreciate it, we can agree with it, we can disagree with it, but we need to be paying attention to how they're asking and answering those questions.
Yeah, this is really good. So for young adults trying to make good decisions, be discerning about what content you consume. For parents trying to help their children deal with it in a way that allows them to, we define discernment as knowing the difference between what is good and genuine and what is bad and counterfeit, and preferring the good and the genuine to the bad and the counterfeit.
I like that.
Okay, so you're going to help us.
Yeah.
For the next 30 or so minutes,
Yes.
we're going to dig into this. I guess where I'd like to begin is thinking about what you've done at Focus on the Family with Plugged In. Describe a little bit of that work, because we don't want people to walk away from this thinking there are no resources for me.
Right.
Because you literally work every single day developing
Yes.
a resource.
Yeah. We started in 1991 as a 4-page newsletter called Parental Guidance. By 1995, that evolved into a magazine. And in 1999, we launched the website. And as we all know, print has sort of gone the way of the dodo and the dinosaur. So the swan song for the magazine was in 2009, and the website has continued to grow.
Okay.
Our bread and butter, what people mostly know us for, or if they know of us and haven't really done a deep dive, they know we review movies. So we review all of the big movies and most of the smaller independent ones that come out each week. But we also review music, TV, video games, YouTube channels, and books. And when I say review, what we hope sets us apart from your average or a typical review is it's not really intended to be our personal subjective opinion. And I'm sure there are people who say, well, yeah, of course it is that. And yeah, it's there. But the bulk of the content in our reviews is us trying to tell you objectively, here's the content you can expect to encounter.
Right.
So our movie reviews are broken into content sections. So we start with an overview of the film. Then we have positive content, spiritual, sexual, violence, profanity, drugs and alcohol. Our catch-all category is other negative elements. You know, if it's a movie about kids who behave badly and rebel against their parents,
Right.
it'll go there. And then a summary conclusion. And our hope is to provide as accurate and objective an overview of what you can expect. And, you know, sometimes we get letters from people, or we don't get letters. We get emails or, you know, texts or that sort of thing saying, hey, you missed this. And then, you know, we may have to go back and look at something again and make an amendment. But our desire is to get it, you know, as close to right as we can. And so I would say we lean probably 80% on evaluating that content from a biblical perspective. And we will give some sort of aesthetic, subjective, but that's about maybe 15 or 20% of our reviews.
How do you account for, in movie reviews in particular, I'm thinking, how do you account for the movie that is perfectly pure, there's no drugs or alcohol,
right?
The language is pristine,
and
the worldview is awful. As opposed to movies where, and there are only a handful like this that I can think of, but the movie has overall a very good theme, but it's got a lot of violent content.
Yeah. You know, I think that one of the ways that we try to deal with that is we think about movies in terms of their intended audience. So if we're reviewing a serious movie that's R-rated, but it's aimed at adults and it has redemptive themes in it, we're going to look at it from that frame. If we're reviewing a kid's movie, we're going to give it, you know, a filter that says, here's who the intended audience is. And we really try to capture that. I mean, we will have movie reviews that our positive content sections might have more than you would expect. And so, especially if there is a positive or a redemptive theme, we want to give it credit for that, but we also want to balance it against, you know, here are the things that are explicit that you'll want to be aware of. And the funny thing about the Christian audience I have found is we're hypersensitive on sexuality and spirituality and largely give violence a pass. And I find that curious.
Christians in
Christian,
general.
And I'm talking about, you know, American evangelicals primarily.
Okay. Yeah.
That seems to be much less of a concern. And so I think we're hypersensitive on those other things, and language too. I mean, we know you get data on everything now. So we know that what people look at, especially where their kids are involved, is they check the sexual content, they check profanity, but sometimes they don't necessarily go much farther than that. And I think that's interesting, you know?
Now, as a parent, I'm thinking of all of this. I will read plugged in reviews, and there are some other reviews that I found to be helpful.
But we won't talk about those.
those other companies.
No, there's other good stuff out there.
There are a number of things. So you should never have to watch a movie or a TV show and be shocked by what you see unexpectedly.
Yes, that's exactly right. And we don't want anybody to be horribly surprised. Now, the flip side of that is we also try to capture what's there, and we don't always make a statement about what is the intent of what's there.
Yeah.
And sometimes people will write in and say, well, you missed this trans character and the emphasis on that. I'm like, well, actually, we noted that somebody was gender ambiguous. We don't actually know the intent if the movie or the producers didn't spell it out. And so there's sometimes that people want us to go harder on something. I'm like, no, we got it. We just didn't necessarily say, this is absolutely what this means in this context.
Yeah. Let's talk about a parental strategy here a
Yeah.
little bit, because I know you, of course, at Focus on the Family, you also have parent and youth departments. You have
Yep.
all these different departments, and I'm sure everybody's trying to work together as best they know how.
Yes.
Given the fact that there are only 8 hours in a day, and
Yeah.
we got a lot of things we got to do.
Yep.
As a parent, to me, I want to be a discerning parent,
Yes.
but more important, I want to raise children who are discerning on their own.
Yeah.
This is something I see with students at Summit Ministries all the time. The parents have been so protective
Yep.
that the children have not learned to think very well.
Yep.
Now, we honor those parents.
Absolutely.
They're trying to do their very best.
Yep.
Parents who care, that's way better than parents who don't care.
Right.
How, though, do we kind of take that step from being discerning parents to raising discerning kids?
Yep. I would love to talk about that. And when you get tired of me talking, you can just raise your hand.
Okay.
So let me say by way of context that my kids are 13, 15, and 17. So this is not an ivory tower conversation to me. My son just decided that he's going to Grand Canyon University next fall. And so we're right there, thinking about college, thinking about next steps. My grid, and I think that we approach it at Plugged In this way too, is that when we think about entertainment, and I'm building on something that a guy at Fuller named Rob Johnston has talked about. He has a grid that he built from Reinhold Niebuhr's book Christ and Culture. This is a truncated version of Rob Johnston's thinking on this. But he talks about approaching movies, but I think it applies to entertainment along a spectrum. And I'm just going to talk about part of it. There's avoidance, there's caution, and there's dialogue. Now, Rob goes farther and talks about how do we experience God. And I think for most of this conversation, those three areas really get the job done. I think that when our kids are younger, our primary sort of base camp is avoidance. And avoidance, not that we're burying our heads in the sand, but that we're staying away from things that we know are destructive. And the worldviews, the ideas, the images, the content, we're protective. I think, and this will vary depending on your kids' maturity, as they move through their teen years, you want to do a couple things. You want to begin to intentionally expose them maybe to a next step kind of conversation, right? And maybe that's the first R-rated movie they see. You don't want it to be when they're having a sleepover at their friend's house, right? So maybe with your 14-year-old son or 15-year-old son, you watch Saving Private Ryan, something that there's stuff there. And I'm sort of just spitballing examples here, but you're engaged in saying, okay, we're intentionally taking that next step out of just the protectivity of avoidance. We're still cautious, but we want to model for them. Our goal is for you to be able to have a dialogue with God, with yourself, and with other people. And we want to practice that in the home.
Yeah.
And then I think, and this is me, and my parents were fairly, I guess, permissive is probably the accurate word. So I'm building on what they did. I really believe in giving your kids increasing amounts of freedom to make their choices, and they're going to sometimes pick things that you're not crazy about. And I think there's a time to say, you know what, I really feel like that's out of bounds and we're not going to go there. But I think by the time your kids are 16, 17, 18, you've got to be giving them the freedom to make some of those choices. And then you talk about it. Well, what do you think about that? What's the worldview here? Like my kids, if I say, what's the worldview here? They just roll their eyes, right? We were watching TV the other night and a commercial came on and my son's like, well, here's the lie in that commercial. I'm like, my work here is through. So I really am an advocate for moving along that spectrum from avoidance to caution to dialogue. We're modeling that. We're showing them that. and we're teaching them to ask those worldview questions. How does this compare to what we believe? How does this make an emotional argument to try to sway you to a position? Like a movie like Million Dollar Baby is about euthanasia. Mm-hmm. It makes a very emotional case for why euthanasia is a good thing. It's important to be able to equip our kids to recognize when a movie or a TV show or a song is making an emotional argument. So that's the short version of my answer to your question.
Yeah. One thing I see with a lot of Christian kids is once they get the idea, everything is about story. God's story is the overarching story of the universe, from creation to consummation. So everything is a story, and all of these movies, and so stories are kind of neutral because everybody has them, and therefore I can absorb any story, and I'm doing a godly thing. Right. That's the next step.
Right.
So many young people will say, "Oh yeah, I went to see such and such a movie." I'm like, "Are you kidding? Why would you put that junk in your mind?"
Right.
And they say, "Well, because there was a redemptive element in it."
Right.
Right. Like,
well, and I think that redemptive element question is an important one. And I think that we also have to teach our kids to say, okay, were you really moved by the redemptive element? Or was the balance of this messaging and images, was it so destructive that what did you really gain? You know, I remember when I was...
It can be an excuse.
Right.
Adam,
no, it can be an excuse. That's exactly right. That's what I'm saying.
That's the thing.
Yep.
Is that all my friends, they go watch all of these movies just because they love all the sex and the violence.
Right.
I go watch them because, it's a story.
Right.
Well, and then they end up doing the same exact thing without discernment.
Yep.
But now they're actually a little bit self-righteous about it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that certainly there can be a time, and I experienced it as a young adult, where you fall in with a group of people who, in the name of our freedom in Christ and grace, and some of these ideas get, I think, distorted in kind of that self-serving kind of way, I can do X, Y, or Z, and there's freedom in Christ. I'm like, okay, time out. Let's have a real conversation about whether that's redemptive or not. When I was 29, I saw the movie American Beauty in theaters, and incredibly nihilistic, disturbing, beautiful movie with about 30 seconds of redemption at the end. And I walked out really disturbed. And the question that I began asking myself is, do I need to see a brilliant picture of depravity to know that depravity is depraved? And maybe there'll be times that there's an intentional reason to do that. But I think more often than not, the discernment response is to say, you know what, I get that. And I get that it's really well done. I get that it's engaging. I get that the story and the characters are interesting. I mean, I saw it with Game of Thrones. I mean, how many Christians do we know that have watched Game of Thrones, but a massive amount of sexual content and violence? And I think we do get desensitized to that. And so we have to be willing to tell ourselves the truth. Am I really mining out the redemption, or am I secretly kind of enjoying some of this other stuff?
Is it fair to say, Adam, that if you're not shocked and disturbed, then your conscience may be seared somehow? I mean, if I'm going to go see a movie or watch a TV show, and this transition only happened probably 5 years ago, where TV shows became worse.
Oh, they're much worse
in terms of sex and violence and language than the movies.
Yeah.
I should be.
There should be a revulsion
stunned.
there.
I should be revolted.
Yeah.
By the things that are unwise or impure.
Yes.
Or turn my thoughts toward myself.
Yeah. Or towards your flesh.
Or my flesh. Or making me feel that, one of the big theme for us right now is just like the heroes today are the people who are the most victimized.
Right.
I should be your hero because I am so completely screwed up
Right.
that, there's no redeeming me. Oh yeah, we worship you,
Right.
and then everybody else says, well, then I need to be really messed up too. Otherwise, people won't feel sorry for me and I won't be noticed.
Right.
You can go down the spiral into a place that's super dark.
Right.
Without ever saying, I want my conscience to be fine-tuned.
Right. Yeah. No, I think you're right. And I think, I look at this stuff for a living, so I'm often not shocked because it's a part of what I do. But I think that our particular calling, there's a kind of spiritual and cultural anthropology that's happening here.
Okay.
And I don't think very many people probably need to go down that path. And so I think if you do see something shocking and you're not shocked, I think it's very fair to say, well, why is that? Is there something that has been deadened in me that I'm just used to it at this point? And that's a fair question. So even as you're talking, I love thinking about, and I want to think about myself. Well, where is my conscience dulled? And where, because there's that constant kind of renewal and engagement. And I think that's where the old fashioned, go back to the word. The word is, again, back to Paul in Romans 12, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And
yes.
And the J.B. Phillips says, don't let the world shape you into its mold. What a great translation of that passage that is.
And that's a tremendous starting point, because that idea of transformation versus conformity.
Yeah.
Am I being conformed to the world? Am I being transformed in my mind by God? And that conformity says don't be conformed to this age. That's also an interesting thing.
Exactly.
It's eon.
Yep.
Which when it gets translated into Latin, by the way, you must be a word nerd because you mentioned something about the Greek.
Yeah, well, my wife has Greek and Hebrew, so we talk about this stuff. She has the doctorate, not me.
But the idea, when it's translated into Latin, it's where we get our word secular, which means to an age of a person.
Interesting.
So the only thing that matters is the time span of your life. That's conformity.
Yeah.
The transformation into the mind of Christ means that we have an eternal perspective on everything that happens during our time span.
I love that. Can I say one other thing about this?
Yes.
Because I think it's germane to the conversation, especially as it regards social media. And we haven't even really talked about that. And we could probably talk for an hour about theological issues with social media. But I think that as parents, especially, we tend to be really concerned with sexual content, and we should be. It's a hugely important area of our lives. And let me say, too, that whether you're comfortable talking about sexuality or not, the culture is. Yeah. And the culture is saying, this is the most important part of your identity. So I'm now on a rabbit trail from where I started. Right. But I think we have to be helping our kids navigate a biblical worldview with regard to the purpose and place of sexuality and what God's designed intent was. Because the culture says two things. It says, it's nothing. It's a trifle. It's like coughing. It's innocent. The whole, pro-sex movement is just, why are we worried about something? It's just a natural function. And then on the other side, the culture says, your sexual identity is the entirety, the primary lens that you should understand yourself and who you are. And even though we as Christians sometimes get pegged as being extreme, we actually have a middle ground perspective that says God designed sexuality for a specific purpose. It reflects our creation in his image, and it creates a union in marriage, and it results in offspring, right? There's it's hugely important, but it's not everything, and it's not nothing. We actually have a perspective that's life-giving, that the culture ping-pongs between these two extremes, and you just watch kids get bamboozled by it.
Right.
And this is everywhere in our culture. right? I mean, this is the message, and that it's the most important part of your actualization as a human being is your sexual expression and experience and identity. I'm like, well, no, that's actually not true. But anyway, that shows up in social media. We worry about that. But I think that social media also just conditions us to be consumers. And so even if we're not consuming content that looks immediately bad, for example, I watch a bunch of guys on YouTube that critique movies, that critique culture. Most of them are coming from a right of center political perspective.
Yeah.
But the stuff on YouTube that pops up is the stuff that's snarky and sarcastic and cynical. And this is a worldview issue that may not be on our radar.
Good point.
How is this stuff that may not look like it's problematic, is it making me smug? Because I don't think smug is a good look for us as Christians.
Yeah.
And so there are ways that media and social media influence us that may not just be Johnny saw a sex scene and now he wants to have sex with his girlfriend, even though that may be really important to deal with. So anyway, I'm now just free associating with myself, Dr. Joe.
No, I appreciate that point about smugness. We deal with this all of the time. A lot of people who are interested in Summit Ministries are also interested in watching things online where they just get this. They have a prurient interest in watching the libs get owned or whatever.
Right.
And it's way beyond just trying to inform yourself to have the mind of Christ.
Yeah.
It is to the point of almost like a vengeful spirit.
And we take that pleasure in being mean. Anyway, I interrupted you.
No, that's exactly where I was going to go with it. I'm very concerned by it. When we're trying to help our children develop discernment, which is something we've got to do it, we can't just be discerning on their behalf. If we discern and we make a good choice and we have a dialogue about a movie, in the meantime, they've watched 20 hours of things in social media, YouTube videos, whatever else.
Yeah.
So obviously one of the principles that I think a lot about is Jesus said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness."
Yeah.
And I think about this all the time. Lord, how do I use the time I have with young adults to not cram things down their throats to make them choke?
Yeah.
But to cultivate a hunger and a thirst for what is right. You're a dad, and you've also helped hundreds of thousands of parents do this. Any insights?
I have lots of thoughts. I think that what my wife and I'll speak a little bit maybe more personally than professionally. We just talk, right? And talk not in terms of it has to be this way or else. We err probably more on the side of a relationship perhaps than some. And let me interrupt myself again and say, I think most of us as parents, there's the truth and grace continuum, right? Most of us have a leaning one way or the other in terms of how we interact with the world and the stuff in the world. And my wife and I probably are more on the grace end of the spectrum. Sometimes you have parents that one is one and one is the other. I think we just have to be aware, whatever our leaning is, I want to be sure that I'm intentionally bringing that other piece into play. But we just talk with our kids and we let them know that nothing is out of bounds. And I was driving home from swim practice with my 8th grade daughter a few months ago. And, she starts saying, one of my friends just told me she's having sex with her boyfriend, 8th grade, 12 years old, 13 years old. And I said, man, I'm so glad you told me that. Let's talk about that. Why do you think she's doing that? Why do you think she told you? What do you think about that? What does God have to say about it? And so there are a lot of things, Jeff, that I think my wife and I have not done very well. But I want my kids to know, man, let's talk about it.
Yeah.
And you can always talk to us, and we're not going to drop the hammer. And that doesn't mean there aren't consequences sometimes, but I don't want to be legalistic. I want to be relationally engaged.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of things that students today don't tell their parents or their teachers because they feel like those individuals would be disappointed with them.
Yeah.
What you're saying is we really want our children's impulse, insofar as we can have something to say about it, to be not to say, oh, I hope my dad doesn't find out.
Right.
But I got to tell my dad, and I got to tell him now.
Yeah.
Because we need to talk this through.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes things will happen that you will think, I wish that hadn't happened. Another story, this is several years ago. If you have children, you know that they always try to get each other in trouble with the parents. That's like, there's no Pharisee like a child. And my two daughters, my computer was at the dining room table and they were doing stuff on it. And they're like, Dad, you got to come see what Henry's been looking at. I'm like, okay, whatever. And somehow they had gotten on his Google Hangouts page and somebody had sent him, a woman had sent him a topless photo and a selfie. And he was 12, 13.
Oh my goodness.
And I mean, it caught me flat-footed, Jeff.
Yeah.
I was not prepared for what I saw. And so we went and got him and we briefly looked at it and he absolutely melted down in, as far as I could discern, confusion. And I'm not naive. You know, my friends had pornography when I was younger than that. And so I wasn't coming from a point of, you know, certainly he could have been inviting that, but it didn't ring true with who I knew him to be. Mm-hmm. And his tears, at one point he just said, I feel so violated. And that led to about a 3-hour conversation with my kids about why we don't put naked pictures of ourselves in a smartphone, on the internet, in a text, anywhere. Now, as far as I can tell, it was unsolicited. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure there'll be some people that'll be like, yeah, buddy, you just got off the naive truck. Could my son have been lying to me? He could have. But I remember saying, you know, sometimes people put naked pictures of themselves on the internet. And he just looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, why would anybody put a naked picture of themselves on the internet? Mm-hmm. Like there was, I felt like their innocence had just been punctured.
Yeah.
Now, I think that my wife and I could have dropped the hammer. I could have said, you're lying. We're getting rid of this garbage. Why won't you tell me the truth? I think there are a lot of responses that we could have had that would have shut down the conversation and that would have communicated anything sexual is shameful and to be hidden, and I'm never talking to mom and dad again. Mm. I think we handled it okay. I wish it hadn't happened, and yet it did happen, and it was an inflection point for our family. And I told my daughters, I said, especially with girls, you will have friends who send naked pictures to their boyfriends at some point. Mm-hmm. And they were young. They were like 9 and 10 at that point, and they're teenagers now. But I share that as an example of, and it snuck through the filters, right? You can set up all the filters and stuff. There's still back alleys that you may not have shut off.
Right.
So even our attempts to control things, I think there's a place for filters, but don't let that give you a false sense of security that now your kids are protected because they can still see stuff.
Yeah. You know, that really affirms the way we think of this at Summit. We see truth and relationship as being two strands of a DNA double helix.
I love that.
And they've got to intertwine together.
Yeah.
The question we're asking every day is, what did I do today to connect truth and relationship for somebody somewhere?
That's a great question.
There's no getting around that.
No, there's
You've got
not.
to have the conversations.
Yep.
So let's talk to the family for a moment. A parent who says, you know, every time I hear this, we got to have more conversations. My heart drops because it's hard. I try to talk to my child and they're like, it's nothing, Mom. I don't want to talk about this or whatever. Are there things that parents can do to open up conversations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the basic conflict rules of when we come at people with you language, there's an implied chest thump there, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that if there's a way into something, as parents, maybe stifling that knee-jerk reaction and even saying, this is kind of what I heard or I saw in this.
Yeah.
I'm curious what you're connecting with. My son really likes Linkin Park. Mm-hmm. The lead singer of Linkin Park commits suicide. And that's an issue. And I'm sharing a lot personally here. In 8th grade, first week of 8th grade, when my son he had just turned 12, he had a classmate who committed suicide. And my son's graduating from high school this year. So that was 4 years ago. And we have been wrestling with the suicide question with him for 4 years because all of a sudden, this is on the table as somebody could choose this. And he's been in therapy. And yet here's a band that deals with that sense of alienation. There's a ton in Linkin Park that I don't like even a little bit. But I've said, okay, you can listen to this, but we're going to talk about the lyrics. We're going to be engaged. And I've given him increasing freedom to make those music choices. And I'm not always crazy about his music choices. But just that instead of the knee-jerk reaction, this is junk. Like I think, especially with music, our kids identify at an incredibly deeply personal level. Mm-hmm. And so if we attack an interest of theirs, and I think this is probably true of video games and maybe movies to a lesser extent, even though we feel like we're attacking this thing, if we come straight at it hard, they may receive that as an attack on themselves. And so if you can say, hey, help me understand, why do you connect with this? Okay. Invite them to share personally and do it genuinely, not as a setup for a gotcha, because our kids know. Our kids know when we're setting them up, right? They just do. We know as adults, if somebody's in a conversation with us and they're leading us in a particular direction, the shields go up, right? So use it as an opportunity to understand. And then you've got, I think, the relational capital to circle back and say, I am not crazy about this. Can we talk about whether or not maybe you don't listen to this song? Or how is this influencing you emotionally? And is that positive? And helping them sort of own their self-assessment of it. Now, that's going to be different with a 10 or 11-year-old than a 16 or 17-year-old.
Sure.
So I'm speaking from a certain level of maturity at this point with your kids.
Yeah. Well, keeping that in mind.
Yeah.
Those kinds of questions, help me understand kinds of questions.
Yeah.
Can be an opener.
Yeah. And just that identity piece, right? Like we live in, you and I, when we were growing up, there was a book series called Choose Your Own Adventure, right? Mm-hmm. Where you would read a chapter and you could say, if you pick this response, go to page 78. If you pick this response, go to page 68. And you could read the same thing 5 times, and it was fun. Everything in our kids' lives is choose your own adventure now.
Right.
You customize everything about your life. If you're playing a video game, you customize every aspect of your avatar. I'm convinced that some of the trans conversation in our culture has been influenced by video games because you get to design everything. So why wouldn't you get to design your own body? You get to do that in video games. And so that identity question is always in play for our kids, and understanding what motivates them, what draws them, what they connect with. Man, I want to know who my kids are and how they see themselves. And if there are some rough edges, I want to be able to come alongside them in that.
Yeah. Okay, in the time that we've got left here, my biggest question for you that I just thinking of You reviewed 600 movies. That's 1,200 plus hours sitting in a theater watching these things.
Yeah.
And it has to be the case that most of them were awful.
Not great. Yeah.
Yeah. But you're reviewing them to help people like me make good decisions.
Yeah.
How do you maintain your walk with the Lord when you're being exposed to all of these terrible things?
Right.
In order to help other people be discerning, it's sort of like being deployed as a soldier. You're taking a lot of shots to protect the rest of us, but how do you protect yourself and how do you stay strong spiritually?
So I think there are several layers to that. And the first one, you mentioned, the Old Testament a little while ago, but we think of ourselves as the watchman on the wall, like Nehemiah, that there are certain people who have a calling or a sense of God moving them into this really weird mission that we have it plugged in. Like counting bad words as a part of my job is a very strange thing. It's a weird job. So I think there's that sense of calling. I think that we do not take for granted God's, I don't want to over spiritualize, but I think there is a kind of anointing and protection in doing this job.
Yeah.
We pray with each other. I'm not going to, and again, I don't want to over spiritualize. We don't pray before we ever go to every movie, but we do pray for each other. There's freedom to say, I don't want to see that movie because, and we actually have different pain points on our team. I don't like jump scare horror movies because they make my chest hurt and I don't want to stroke out in a horror movie. That's not how I want to go.
Yeah.
With regard, especially to the sexual content, because that's one that we have specific questions about. I think that what we do is not unlike a clinical experience in that I go to the movie with a notebook, a pen, a flashlight, and I will take 50 to 75 pages of notes over the course of a movie.
Wow.
So I'm not going to say that keeps me from seeing the images. I can remember movies that had a lot of stuff in them. I can honestly say I've never had anything from work stay with me in a way that felt detrimental to my faith. And I think that's because there is protection there. But I do think that there's something very clinical. We're almost like, as I said earlier, cultural anthropologists. We're looking, we're taking notes. And I think that protects. I think the act of getting it down on paper, or not on paper, on the keyboard, it's in, it's out, and I move on. And weirdly enough, there's a kind of protection in a strange way in the quantity of stuff that we do, because in a typical week, I might write 5 or 6 pieces and be exposed to different things, but I'm moving through it pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So stuff doesn't have a lot of time to sort of sit and fester. And I think if we do see something that's particularly bad, there's space to come back to the team afterwards and say, hey, can you pray through this with me? And that doesn't happen a lot, but occasionally we have one person on our team who doesn't like to review spiritually demonic horror because that really affects that person on our team adversely. Another person doesn't really like movies with a ton of profanity. So it's not always just the sexual content. And I work with our editor in terms of making assignments. And we've recently begun drawing some lines in terms of stuff that just have such a massive amount of sexual content that we're not going to review all of those things. So there are layers there, but I think all of those things together, that sense of calling, taking notes, getting it out, moving on, all of that provides some protection.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I've loved this conversation. Thank you. I feel better equipped as a parent.
Good.
But I also feel like I understand some of what you do. The way you described just the massive amount of content and how you approach it clinically sounds very similar to friends of mine who've been in police work.
Yeah.
You've got to deal,
or a doctor. I mean, there's a biological component there too.
You've got to deal with the seamy side Doctors have to deal with the seamy side of disease.
Yep.
Sometimes people cause their diseases.
Yeah.
You got to deal with all of that. The after effects of people's criminal activity, all of that.
Yeah.
There are people who need to do that. It's a special calling.
Yeah.
Adam, thanks so much for being on the show today.
You bet. Thank you, Dr. Jeff.
Thank you to my guest, Adam Holz, for coming on the show today. This podcast is a resource of Summit Ministries. At Summit, we exist to come alongside the rising generation, their trainers, parents, and influencers, so that the young people in our time may know God's truth and become champions of a biblical worldview. Now, you might want to know more about Plugged In. That's easy to find. Plugged In, the movie reviews, album reviews, so forth, pluggedin.com. It's a ministry of focus on the family. To find out more about Summit Ministries or get some of the resources that we have available, just visit summit.org. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to today's episode. The Dr. Jeff Show podcast is a resource of Summit Ministries. Summit equips and supports the rising generation to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. If you want more resources that can help you live out a biblical worldview as a student or reach the next generation as an educator, church leader, or parent, head over to summit.org/resources to find out about the programs, the articles, the videos, the ebooks, and more that we offer. Also, if you're looking for more great podcasts that will build your faith and inspire you, our friends at Edify have what you need. You can find more podcasts, including the Dr. Jeff Show podcast, on the Edify app. Download it at edify.app, spell EDIFI. And then you can also search for it in the Apple Store or the Google Play Store.